Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
I would like to introduce Miki Kashtan to you. Miki Kashtan is the co-founder of the Bay Area Nonviolent Communication. She has led workshops and intensive retreats on 5 continents. And in her time with meeting all of these different people and teaching all of these different people, she brings to her work this unwavering faith that the world can truly work for everyone. We're so pleased to be able to frame this conference and the concept of bullying and how we approach it by kicking off our summit today with this fabulous person, Miki Kashtan.
Hi, everyone. I need to talk to the mic, of course. I was wondering why I wasn't hearing the echo. I want to say that it's incredibly moving, and I feel quite emotional being here because seeing a community come together as a community to address this instead of having it be, this is somebody else's problem, is very, very meaningful for me. And to have this opportunity possibly to contribute to this means a lot. So I want to start with a story about a young man who is 16, who you could say has a likely profile of a bully. And the story took place when a colleague of mine did a 2-day workshop in a high school in San Francisco. And this boy's name is obviously not the right name, but let's call him Zeke. And on the second day of the workshop, which included all kinds of people, Zeke was a member of the Ku Klux Klan at 16. And he was incredibly uncomfortable having Jews and lesbians and people of color and all of these things in the workshop. And at some point, when it turned out that one of the girls in the workshop, her sister, was about to have a marriage ceremony with another woman, he just didn't hold it together anymore and said, "That's just wrong." To which you can imagine there was a big uproar. And now this is a kind of situation that leaves many people helpless about how to address. How do you actually intervene in a situation like this? So I'm going to read to you some of what my colleague did in her voice. So it's going to say I, but that's not me. It's my colleague. So she says, "Are you uncomfortable because there are people here you're not used to connecting with? Can you imagine really trying to connect with a person who is saying something that is so contrary to what you believe in?" Zeke replied with reasoning to explain his beliefs about why certain people are just born inferior. And went on, and there was back and forth, and at some point he says, "Well, you know, I hate these people, but don't get me wrong, I'm not a violent person. I wouldn't want harm to come to them. I just hate certain people." And she stayed with him. She stayed with him to meet him where he was. She says, "Well, now I'm confused because you're saying you hate these people, yet you don't want any harm to come to them. I'm guessing you might even have some confusion about your feelings towards these people because you say you don't want to be violent, yet you speak of hate." And he was sitting there like this with a very intense look. So she meets him right there. And she says, "I'm still confused about your choice to be a member of the KKK. From what I've known, they have created an amazing amount of violence against the folks you say you hate. Can you tell me why you joined? What was your primary motivation to join? Really engaging him in dialogue. Zeke looked right into me. My dad is a member of the KKK. The room bristled with comments. One student chimed in, "Hey man, just because your dad's a hater doesn't mean you gotta be one too." Nodding to that profound statement, my colleague, added, looking as intensely into Zeke's eyes as he had into mine, "I'm actually hearing how much you'd like to connect to your dad. I'm also hearing that maybe you feel conflicted about being a member of an organization that tries to create connection through violence and hating others." Leaning toward Zeke, trying to tangibly soften the room with my presence, "Has this really met your need to connect with your father?" Zeke's eyes swelled with water, but he was not going to cry. Not in front of this group. "Yeah." Zeke paused to take a full inhale and exhale, audible to the room, maybe a bit from the gravity of the realization and a bit to stop the tears. "I guess I joined because I wanted to connect with my dad. I just want to get along with him." He walked up to me after the workshop. "You know, that was the first time I felt fear begin to leave my body. I'm actually relieved." With his new clarity, he began to assess the effectiveness of his choice and decided that hating others was not truly his path, not an expression of his authentic presence. He was able to get past the enemy image his mind had created and the fixed ideas he had about himself to see what he needed. Zeke quit the Ku Klux Klan, developed all sorts of friends, and continued to work on various strategies to find connection with his dad. That's the vision. That is the vision that inspires my work. And I want to now unpack it in very, very, very small bits so that we can go together from where we are to how you can embrace that kind of response to something that is so painful, damaging, and harmful as bullying or any other kind of violence. So in order to do that, I'm going to start by asking, what are the causes of violence? What do you imagine are the causes of violence? So I would like to ask you for a moment to imagine, for a few minutes, for the next few slides, I'd like to ask you to imagine that you are someone who is resorting to violence. To unseparate yourself, whether you've ever resorted to violence or not, to break the gap between you and an other, some other that is the violent person, the bad person, and imagine that you are that person, and try to imagine what could possibly be happening inside of you that would lead you to resort to violence. I just want to take a moment in silence for each person to actually make that contact inside you. Thank you for joining me in that incredibly human act of trying to understand by entering somebody else's shoes. And let me tell you what I have found in my work and in my readings about what causes violence. And I want to tell you that all these slides are in a printed handout that all of you will receive at the end of the workshop, so you don't have to copy anything. You'll have it. Let me just confirm with Deborah that that is indeed the case. Yeah, on the table there's... So I read a book that affected me deeply by James Gilligan. Anybody that wants to do something about violence, I'm surprised that this book is not like all over the place in all programs. His book is called Violence, Our Deadly Epidemic and Its Causes. The guy was the chief psychiatrist in the Massachusetts prison system for 25 years. So you can't say that he doesn't come from authority of first-hand knowledge. He talked one-on-one with untold numbers of people who have done the most amazingly brutal acts of violence. And he came out of these years with two conclusions. One is that every act of violence somewhere is an attempt to create justice, to right a wrong that happened before. Now that wrong might have happened 2 seconds before or might have happened 50 years before. But there's somewhere in the person's deep organism some wrong that has happened that needs to be righted. And the violence is an expression of that. Now we can all understand the pull to justice, but why does it go to violence rather than to other means? And here is the most, kind of like heavily weighing on my heart piece of it, which is it's shame. All the people that he had talked with, essentially without exception, were carrying boatloads of shame in them about who they are, about what has happened to them, about what they want, and most particularly about anything that had to do with tenderness, with any need for love, for connection, for appreciation. They had so much shame about it. And so, one of the things that are so clear coming out of this is that punishment makes things worse. Punishment makes things worse because it increases shame. If shame is at the root of violence, punishment is not going to work. It's only going to make the person get into a deeper loop about who they are. Now, not only am I ashamed about everything else, now I'm ashamed about the things that I've done and I've been punished, I've been ostracized. There's no room for me. That's James Gilligan. Marshall Rosenberg, who is my teacher, the man who created nonviolent communication, he defines violence as an expression of unmet needs. He says a tragic expression, and I agree with that. There's a profound, radical vision inherent in this way of framing it, which has two parts. One is that no matter what the person does, there is a need underneath it that is a basic core human need that we all share. James Gilligan says it's the need for justice. It can be other things too. Second, isn't that embarrassing? I just forgot what the second piece is. Give me a second. Yes. Second is that if we want to eradicate violence from the world, the thing to do is to meet more people's needs. Essentially, think about it like this. Somebody whose needs are well met has no reason to go to a place of violence. It is only when our needs are not met that we're going to go to a place of violence. So think about a systemic approach of how can we meet more people's needs that will reduce violence. Last thing is Alice Miller. And by the way, the references to all of these materials are also in the handout that you will receive. Actually, you can nobody will give it to you, but you can take it at the table. So Alice Miller, who studied extreme people who have done extreme violence, her conclusion is that violence is always reactive. It is never something that just comes from some innate thing, that there are people who have all these theories about innate violence. She says no. If somebody is violent, you can always find something in their history that was done to them. So that's what I want to say about the causes of violence. And I am very eager to be interactive with you to the minimal extent possible. So I'd like to know if there's any 1 or 2 questions that anybody has about this, because this is kind of like the foundation on which everything else that I want to say rests. So if anybody wants to ask a question, please do so. Yes. I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it.
It's been my experience that oftentimes bullying is not always violent, but it can be very controlling and manipulating and threatening, but it's not necessarily violent.
Okay, so the woman says it is her experience that bullying is not necessarily violent. It can be manipulative, controlling, I forget what the other words, but not necessarily violent. So I hear through what you're saying that you define violence as only physical. And for me, every act of bullying is an act of violence, because it is violating the integrity of another human being. Whether it's their physical integrity or their emotional or spiritual integrity, it's not different for me. Does that make sense to you?
Thank you for clarifying.
Anything else? Yes, Marla.
I'm connecting your what you're saying about unmet needs to bullying, and wondering where academic stress and not being successful academically would contribute to violence.
So Marla is looking at that question of unmet needs and wondering about the degree to which academic stress, and what was the second piece?
Well, just not being successful.
And academic stress and not being successful can, contribute to bullying. Absolutely, to the extent that there's shame about it. In other words, there are people who don't have very high aspirations, who truly don't have high aspirations. Not like they're playing sour grapes. If they truly don't have academic aspirations, it's no big deal. I don't do well in school, who cares? But if there is a gap between what you want and what you get, and especially if other people are looking down on you, then yes, it would add. Thank you. So I'm glad I made room, and I want to move forward and say that, again, we know it's very easy, clearly, to understand that the person who is on the receiving end of bullying suffers a lot of consequences. And the consequences are extreme. And again, in your handout, you can see some statistics. There's depression, there's suicide. That's why when you're saying it's not violent, if people respond to bullying with suicide some of the time, that tells me that it's deeply violent. There is failure in school. There's all kinds of things, including, and that fits in with what Alice Miller says, that people who've been bullied, many of them turn around and bully others. So that one is easy to see. Violence also has consequences for the person who bullies. And again, since I invited you to occupy the bully for a few minutes, I hope you haven't forgotten that. Imagine that you've just bullied someone, you've been found out, and all the consequences that are going to happen to you, the ostracism, everything that happens to you, people being afraid of you, even though you might get some sense of respect from it, you're also left alone. It's not an easy thing to be the bully. Think about it. Can you feel it? Inside you, imagine being the bully. It's not easy. Children who witness also suffer, even if it doesn't happen to you. I see that there are students here, so I imagine you know what I'm talking about. That if you see it happening to someone else, it affects you also. When is it going to happen to me? Or why am I not courageous enough to speak up and do something about it? Or what's wrong with the system? Or whatever it is, it's incredibly stressful to know that it even exists. And lastly, the adults are also affected. Caring for the children, whether it's your own child or other children, and the incredible sense of helplessness. I'm curious to know if the adults that are here in the audience, would you raise your hand if you feel a sense of helplessness when you hear about stories of bullying? So it is quite prevalent. And part of the tragedy is that there is very little effective conversation between people about it, because again, there's a bit of shame often that comes in, I'm not supposed to be helpless. I'm an adult, I'm supposed to know what to do. So there's a lot of stress about this for everyone. So I want to just very quickly review the current responses. And I am absolutely not talking about Albany High School because I don't really know what programs exist or don't exist. I'm talking in general. The general types of responses are not successful. And how we know that they're not successful is the very fact that I think it's like 2/3 of children don't report bullying when it happens. Why would you not report something that happens? Because you don't trust that the responses will work. If you trusted the responses, you would report it. It's basic logic. Very few are able to stand up for themselves, and the bullies don't get support. They are either ignored or punished. They don't actually, in the current existing systems, they don't get support. They're told to change the behavior. Nobody gives them, I don't know nobody, but in general, they don't get tools for what to do so that they can change the behavior. They're just told that they're bad and wrong and should change, which is the very thing that creates more shame. So I want to look at what we can do to have different responses. And I'm going to divide it into immediate responses and then longer term responses. In other words, there are two moments that exist around bullying. A moment when bullying happens and all the other moments. And when bullying is actually happening, or you want to intervene immediately to stop it. And I want to say a bit more about that in a moment. There's also very basic things that can be done that have been proven to reduce bullying, even though they don't address the root causes. And I'm going to say something about those. And that's all about the activity itself. Clearly, if we look at the idea that the fundamental cause of bullying is systemic absence of enough met needs within the system, then we need to do something to create more opportunities for needs to be met. And they're not necessarily needs about academic achievement, although I can understand that that would be part of it. As far as I understand it, it's primarily needs related to identity. Who am I? Am I accepted? Do I matter? Do I have autonomy? Some years ago, I did a workshop for teachers. And I asked them to list the needs that they believe children bring to school with them, that they, the teachers, want to support the children in meeting. Very elementary question. They listed a whole list of needs. There was one need that had a glaring absence for me. And I want to tell you what it is. It's the need for choice, for autonomy. It's not even that the teachers said, kids have this need and we don't want to help them meet it. It's that it didn't register on their radar screen. And it's an incredibly important need that when it gets stifled, creates so much anger, resentment, and helplessness in the young people who are trying to carve out a sense of life and meaning for themselves in a system where avenues for contribution and meaningful participation are incredibly limited. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the immediate things that can be done, and then move over to talk about the more larger responses. So the fundamental thing about the immediate responses is that you want your focus to be on safety and effectiveness. So it's what you want to create rather than what you want to oppose. So instead of thinking of it as anti-bullying, which I understand why you would want to say that, think of it, how do we create more safety and effectiveness within our school system? Even just doing this reframe already liberates something. So within that context, I want to make a distinction between using force to create safety, to protect people, and using force to punish. And if we remember that punishment increases shame, and we are witnessing, and I'm saying we, meaning adults, if we are witnessing an incident of bullying or any other form of something that can create harm for one student, we want to intervene even with the use of force, purely with the intention to protect, to separate, to create safety, without thinking that the bully is bad. That is a piece that needs to change so that there can be connection with the bully and the bully can be supported. Then I want to talk about, I want to pause for a second, just see if there is a question or two here before I continue, because now I'm going to talk about beyond the immediate, and there are things you can do like stagger recess. There's research about all of these things, and it's not my expertise, so I don't want to focus on it, but the information is out there. I want to just see if there's anybody who has any question or clarification that you want about what I said in terms of use of force. Yes?
Well, actually, I was looking for more definition of what you meant by lack of choices causing the frustration that led to bullying. It was a little ways back, but I'm still... So this person here is not fully connected with what I mean about young people not having a sense of choice. I think that all you would need to do is listen to any one of them talk without interrupting with them, without countering them, and just open your heart to listen. And I think you will find out. Good, thank you.
Yes?
I wanted to hear more about when you say the use of force, I mean, really clearly what to do. So you're on the, like in a scenario where...
Whatever it takes, as long as your intention is to protect and create safety and not to punish.
Okay, and these are with kids that you may or may not have a relationship with, right?
It's whatever you can do, whatever you can do. The key point is not what the force is. It's, for me, because this is my expertise, is not about use of force. I'm only bringing in the piece, the critical piece, that if you want to change the cycle of violence, remove the punitive intent.
Once that's removed, whatever you do will probably be okay. It's kind of what you're
In the moment. And then you have to connect with all the people, which is what I'm going to go to next. Because if you just use force without doing the connection, it will feel punitive even if your intention is not. Okay, so I want to... Yes?
What about for like those kids who get bullied for like so extensively that they commit suicide, and you said that we shouldn't like respond with force to them? Like, what about the parents for them? They would want justice for like what happened to their kid, and their child was being bullied so much that they decided to take their own life.
Yeah, so you're talking about, you're asking, like, what happens when bullying is so extreme that it just, leads to suicide or to extreme responses, and what would justice look like in a situation like this? Did I get your question? So this is a great segue into what I wanted to go to next, and thank you for this question, because I want to look at two visions of justice that exist. One is our familiar vision of justice, which there's a technical word for it. It's called retributive justice. Retributive justice means you've done this, and in retribution, this is the punishment that's going to be given to you. And it's a system that's been in most of the world for thousands of years. And I don't know about you, I don't see the effectiveness of that system. So in many indigenous cultures, there existed a parallel system of justice called restorative justice. The principle of restorative justice is that whenever there is an act of violence of any kind of harm, it's not only the person who receives the harm that is harmed. Relationships within the community are losing their quality of trust. And you can see that if you look at bullying. Okay, so maybe that particular kid commits suicide, but it affects everyone else. So the question that a restorative justice perspective brings up is, what can we do to restore trust, to restore what has been lost in the community as a whole? It's an entirely different approach to justice. It's an approach that says that human beings can come back together no matter how much damage has been done, and restore and repair what has happened. Now, if somebody died, there's nothing you can do to undo that, but you can reconnect beyond the consequences of that. One of my favorite examples of that is very well known by most people is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that took place in South Africa after Nelson Mandela got to power. Are you familiar with that? I'm asking you in particular. No. So I would encourage you to all read about it, research it, because it is such a different vision. And that's the vision of what I am thinking of. And there is two pieces to it. It's what happens after and what do you do to prevent. And I am doing my best to squeeze things into less time than I was told I would have. And that's just how it is with life. What a restorative response does, it focuses on compassion and responsibility, both. So the key thing that has been discovered, and there is tons of research on restorative justice all over the world, the key thing is that I have gleaned from what I know is, if you get the person who did whatever they did to understand two things. One is really connect with the effect that it had on another person. And second, really understand what was going on inside of them that led them to do it. That's the foundation on which change can happen. You see how different that is from a punishment that doesn't really tell you anything about you and what you can do to make a difference inside yourself and around you. So those are the two key pieces. Open your heart to the other person and open your heart to yourself. That's the restorative approach. So this ends up encouraging children to get help when you have such systems. And it provides support for everyone, because when you do a restorative process, it involves more than just the people who were directly involved. It involves whoever else is directly connected to this. Sometimes it can be the entire school community, and these can be very powerful moments. And it also allows the whole community to be involved. And I want to say in this moment, I was going to say it later, in case it feels overwhelming, like, oh my God, how do we possibly do that? I had in mind that out of this event might come a small group of passionate people, students, teachers, administrators, counselors, parents, and community members, but a much smaller group that wants to get together over time and figure out a system for transforming this. Because I'm not a believer in the idea that people come together for one day and that changes things. If you want systemic change, you have to put systemic effort. So I would be more than thrilled to connect with a group like this if one emerges, to kind of like meet over time and see what can be done. There are preventive responses, and I want to briefly analyze a program that exists that is incredibly successful. It's called the Roots of Empathy. I'm curious how many people have heard about this program. So it's sad that so few people have heard of it. Let me tell you about it. It's a program that started in Canada, and it's extraordinarily simple. A baby, an infant, comes to a classroom once a month for a relatively short amount of time, and the same baby comes every month, and the children in the class get an opportunity to play, interact, watch the child grow, and all of this over the course of the school year, and it has dramatic results in terms of reducing incidents of violence in the schools where it has been applied. And I wanted, from the perspective that I have been putting here, I wanted to kind of look like, why is this program successful? It looks almost crazy. Why would hanging out with a baby for a few hours over the course of the year have such a profound effect? Here is why. What the children learn is they learn to connect with the human dignity of every person. They learn to understand feelings and needs. They learn to respect vulnerability, which is one of the key things that are so difficult. The culture of cool is not a culture that honors human vulnerability. Seeing a baby where babies are always allowed to be vulnerable changes something fundamental in that culture. Also, it increases the capacity to see that people can change over time. So there is part of what often happens in the traditional responses is a static image of what human beings are like. So that's about all that I want to say about this. And again, there is a little more information about it in the handout. I think so. Roxy, is there? Yeah. Okay, I want to pause again to see if there are questions or comments at this point. Anybody from the back? I haven't really engaged with people in the back. Okay, go for it.
Are continuation high school students sometimes related with elementary school students helping to tutor? And I think they got just exactly what you're saying out of that relationship.
Let me repeat that some students had an opportunity to tutor younger students, and this gentleman believes that that had a similar effect on them. I could easily believe that. Yes?
You mentioned infants be in the program rules and program. How young is the baby?
Infant, literally infant, like the first year of life. They basically accompany a baby in their first year of life. And you can read about it. The information is completely out there, and the program started in Canada and is getting more and more into the US. Yes?
Isn't some of the impact of that, I'm thinking, okay, some of these kids probably had little siblings, but it's sort of the public nature of they're doing it with their peers. They're being vulnerable or being...
Yeah, so the idea that I'm hearing is that perhaps part of what is happening in these times is that there is a public acknowledgement of vulnerability, not just in the private family sphere. That may very well be the case. So I want to move forward and look at systemic responses. The first piece, I've kind of already talked about it, and that is that bullying is a whole community problem. It's not a problem of specific individuals. And instead of looking at what's wrong with this individual, if we start asking the question, what is happening in this system that makes it possible for people to be bullies? And what can we as a community do to give people other avenues for expressing themselves? Then we start shifting the climate. Just even asking that question, we stop singling out individuals. And the singling out in itself is so painful that it itself can contribute. And then the logical questions, the question that comes from that is the question of what can we do to meet everybody's needs? Really simple and radical question. I know that I went through school, through my entire youth, without anybody ever seriously asking me what I needed. That simply didn't happen. And so part of what that creates is, because I believe that we are creatures of practice, we become what we practice. If we don't practice knowing what our needs are, we're not likely to be able to live from a place of clear connection with the needs. So knowing what our needs are is a key thing. Finding out ways of meeting those needs, again, it's both an individual and a systemic piece. And the third question is, how can we involve everyone in creating a solution? So that goes back to this idea that I had of having a group that is made up of representatives of all the different groups that will look together at how to address the question instead of having the adults design it for the children. Because the children's voices are rarely included in coming up with responses. I can tell you that my sister and her partner started involving their child in solving problems when he was 2. They would come to him and say, we want this and you want that, and it doesn't work together. What can we do to make it work for both of us? And they said that about a quarter of the time he would come up at 2 with ideas that they hadn't thought of. So do not underestimate the creativity that is unleashed in younger people when you give them the respect that their ideas truly matter. And it's not a pro forma asking them for input. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go do whatever we decided we were going to do. It's like really and truly involving. So I just wanted to, as I'm wrapping up, give you the vision that I see of what's possible. So everybody is safe. If anything happens, it's not possible to create a conflict-free world. It is possible to create a world in which conflict becomes an opportunity for deeper connection. And I could get more into that, but not in the moment. And so having a vision that conflict is not the end of the world, that you can reconnect, you don't have to give up on yourself or anyone else, that's part of the vision. We help each person to meet their needs. No one is ostracized. Can you imagine that, creating a world in which no one is ostracized? I was an ostracized child. I went through a period of 3 months in which no one spoke to me at school. So I know very, very deeply what that is like, and I really want to create a world in which this just doesn't happen. And key to it is to be able to talk fully about what happens without blaming anyone. So it's not about being nice. It's not about, putting things under the rug. It's about addressing it with love rather than with blame. Love the bully. Anybody who's read, the Bible knows about loving the enemy. Love the bully. That's the only way that you can find the heart of what's under there that is so hidden and protected. And so what I wanted to finish with is just, I've told you a little bit about what I think that you can do, and I also want to tell you something that, another thing that we have thought about the possibility of doing, which is to bring in a team of, we call them conflict coaches, people that can come to the school maybe once a week or however often it ends up being, to be able to hear and listen to everyone and to help establish a restorative justice system within the school community. That's my hope that can be done, and thank you very, very much. I appreciated hearing the input. I wish there was more time to talk with everyone, and I'll be here for a few minutes if anybody wants to talk with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that talk, Miki. A few logistical details as